Hey guys, my name is Alex. Right now I'm doing something called Thousand Movie Project, which means that I'm watching in chronological order all the movies listed in Stephen J. Schneider's book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die, and I'm writing a response piece to each one of those movies, and then I'm posting that shit on thousandmovieproject.com. Today I wanted to talk about Orson Welles, in particular his second movie, The Magnificent Ambersons, which no one seems to talk about anymore. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because Orson Welles is going to be a big deal this November on account of his final movie, The Other Side of the Wind, is coming out on Netflix after 40 years in development hell, and also there's a documentary being released that same day on Netflix called They'll Love Me When I'm Dead, about the making of that final movie. Orson Welles is obviously best known for his first movie, CITIZEN Kane, which is kind of a sprawling mystery that recounts the life of a super wealthy newspaper tycoon named Charles Foster Kane, who, on his deathbed, says the word Rosebud before suddenly dying, and then his nurse tells this to a journalist, and the journalist interviews major players from Kane's life to find out what that word must have meant for Kane himself, and we, the audience, learn at the end that Rosebud was the name of a sled that he used to ride as a kid. But if you want to point to the fact that Charles Foster Kane was, in fact, based on a real-life newspaper tycoon named William Randolph Hearst, you might also want to mention that Rosebud was the name that Hearst allegedly bestowed on his girlfriend's genitalia. Rosebud. So Citizen Kane goes on to be recognized almost immediately as one of the greatest movies ever made, even though it loses that year's Best Picture Academy Award to a weepy, earnest Irish family saga called How Green Was My Valley, a title which, while we're on the subject of nicknames for genitalia, is kind of a miracle. But so it's 1941, and Orson Welles is in his 20s, but he's also already being called a boy genius, and let me tell you from personal experience, that a 20-something genius who's just shaken up the world with his masterpiece debut can be pretty stressed out in trying to decide what his next project is going to be. And so Welles naturally goes all over the place, and he says, we'll do a thriller next, no, we'll do a romance, or no, we'll do Shakespeare, or no, we'll do a noir. He's got a ton of energy, and he's got financial backers and people who believe in him, and so he feels like he can do whatever the fuck he wants. Which in a sense was kinda true, but it was also very much not true. Orson Welles actually couldn't do whatever the fuck he wanted, and that was because of the one major artistic obstacle that stood in his way, the one that he would never overcome, which was himself. Namely the fact that he was really good at starting projects and convincing people to participate and getting their hopes up and making everyone believe that he was going to do something really amazing, but then seemed almost constitutionally incapable of following anything through to the end. This would happen to Orson Welles all the time. He'd follow something through to the point where he had his finger on a hair trigger that would have immediately set everything into the great onerous motion that ideally culminates in a fully fledged movie picture, but alas, he could never follow through. Or he followed through every now and then. I mean, the guy got some shit done. But anyway, so he decides that his next movie is going to be The Magnificent Ambersons, which is an adaptation of a popular novel at the time, and it's a family saga about a kid who's a fucking prick and who comes from a wealthy family and his dad isn't in the picture and Joseph Cotton is hitting on his mom. It's a melodrama with great camera work and it runs at a swift pace, and Orson Welles is a delightful narrator with that smoke and caramel baritone.
It was Shakespeare who posed the question, what's in a name? That in modern-day commerce, the answer would be everything. When you buy a Nashua copier...
And it actually makes me kind of angsty to think about what a fucking rock star he would have been in the podcasting game if he were alive in the 21st century, or even just the sort of local celebrity he'd have been working at a drive-thru.
It's light and crisp. It's delicious.
And I thought it was strange to have never heard of The Magnificent Ambersons before I started Thousand Movie Project, because you would think that if a 25-year-old made something that's widely considered the greatest movie of all time, and then, a year later, he came out with an equally ambitious follow-up movie that's widely regarded as a masterpiece, you would think that you would have probably heard about it. And maybe people have heard about it, and I'm just not in the loop, like I was in the bathroom during that third grade module on The Magnificent Ambersons. The reason The Magnificent Ambersons probably isn't talked about all that much today is because it's one of those movies that's haunted by the ghost of what it could have been but never became. And the reason it never became what it could have been is because Welles, its director, didn't shepherd that production through to the end. And by the end, I mean the very end, the editing process. Because right when Welles was finished shooting The Magnificent Ambersons, he was sent by his production company, RKO, to Brazil. Because remember, this was the early 1940s, and the war was on, and the US was kind of worried about the neutrality of South America. Because you see, all these countries were looking at the US and England and France and Germany all fucking killing each other and throwing bombs and sinking ships, and they were like sidestepping the whole affair like, no me tocas. And the US started worrying about Hitler maybe going over to South America with like croquetas and flan and befriending some pretty heavy-duty countries, which would mean that we, the United States, would be dealing with Nazi superpowers that were like a stone's throw away from us. And apparently some high-ranking officials in the US government determined that that would be fucking terrible. And so they were like, we need to allocate some heavy-duty resources to building good relationships with South America, whereupon they gave the matter some long, serious consideration, and then assembled a care package for the South, containing the aforementioned croquetas, flan, and a priapic dough-faced 26-year-old theater nerd by the name of Orson Welles. The idea was that they would send a handsome, young, hotshot movie genius over to Brazil to make a glorious documentary about how wonderful Brazil is. It would introduce Brazilian culture to the United States in a way that would be sexy and mystical and gorgeous, and would probably lead to a tourism spike in Brazil, meaning much money for the Brazilian government. The documentary would be called It's All True, written and directed by Orson Welles. Sounds great, right? Except it wasn't great, because Orson Welles was 26 years old and he didn't know what to do with his penis, and so he put it anywhere he could manage, and he was constantly drunk and he was not getting anything done. He'd show up hungover to the set and putz around, and they'd set up shots, and his colleagues would report back track this strange phenomenon where they'd spend the whole day actively working under Welles' direction, and yet somehow, miraculously, nothing got done. Meanwhile, back in the US of A, Magnificent Ambersons is done being edited, and audiences are seeing it for the first time at test screenings, and the audiences are just balking. They're like, seriously? The world is at war and you made a 2-hour melodrama? So the studio starts freaking out, and they're like, wartime audiences don't want to be sad when they go to the movies. We need to lighten this up. But the people who were originally affiliated with the production of Magnificent Ambersons, they know that, like, the movie's fucking perfect. And so they get in touch with Orson Welles, who's back over in Brazil, and they're like, hey, the studio's gonna cut up your movie. Maybe you should, like, come back so they don't fuck it up. But Orson Welles is like,
Estou fazendo sexo e não posso falar agora.
But so RKO ends up cutting the movie down to something shorter and happier, and, in effect, they've hobbled it. They take away its emotional punch. As for the documentary Orson Welles was working on in Brazil at the time, he never finished it. The footage was assembled into a weird little thing in the 1990s and released as like a curiosity piece. Orson Welles regretted not having saved the Magnificent Ambersons for the rest of his life. Although the excised footage of Magnificent Ambersons is said to have been destroyed, there was never any concrete proof of its destruction, and so Welles held out hope to the very end that he could track down that footage. When the final verdict, following an exhaustive search, was that the footage had, in fact, been destroyed, it's rumored that Orson Welles, a man with little left to cling to, sat down and wept.